The wedding was not a wedding at all, at least not in the way a young girl might dream of it. There were no flowers, no music, no laughter echoing through a church or down a country lane. Instead, it was a dry, wind-swept courtyard behind her family's mud brick home, the air heavy with dust and resentment. Maria stood trembling, her hands clenched together in front of her, her long braid falling like a rope down her back. She was barely 16, her body still fragile, her eyes wide with the frightened look of a fawn caught in the open. Before her stood the man her family had traded her to, Don Evaristo, a rancher older than her father, with a face wrinkled like old leather and a body bent slightly by years of hard labor and hard drinking. His beard was white and patchy, his hands swollen and cracked, his voice a gruff bark that silenced even the wind. Her family stood behind her, some with pride, others with shame carefully hidden behind stoic faces. Her mother avoided her gaze altogether, wringing the corner of her shawl. Her father, stiff and stern, held his chin high as if this was some noble act, as if marrying his daughter to a man who could be her grandfather in exchange for a single cow was something honorable. But Maria saw it for what it was, desperation. Their land was barren, their debts many, their bellies often empty. And the cow Don Evaristo had offered was more valuable to them than her tears, more precious than her youth, more needed than her happiness. Maria's lips quivered as she tried to whisper a prayer, but her voice failed. She felt the eyes of the villagers who had gathered, some to witness, some to gossip. A few women shook their heads in pity, others whispered cruelly about how Maria had always been too quiet, too plain, too obedient, the kind of girl who could be bartered without protest. The men chuckled behind their hats, laughing at the absurdity of an old man taking such a young bride. The laughter cut deeper than the marriage contract itself. The priest, weary and expressionless, muttered through the vows as if he had done this many times before, as if the sanctity of the moment no longer carried any weight. Maria barely heard him, her ears rang with the thumping of her own heart. When the old man gripped her wrist with his rough hand and shoved a tarnished ring onto her trembling finger, her knees nearly buckled. It was not a gesture of love but of ownership. She was no longer her father's daughter but the property of Don Evaristo. When the ceremony ended, the crowd dispersed with murmurs and smirks, some muttering blessings, others jokes. Maria's younger siblings ran to the cow, giggling with excitement, stroking its hide as if it were a miracle. To them, it was. To her, it was a symbol of betrayal. She felt a hollow ache in her chest that no words could soothe. She wanted to scream, to cry, to plead with her mother to take it all back, but her voice was locked inside her throat, smothered by shame. Don Evaristo tugged her forward like a man pulling along a mule. "Come," he growled, his tone impatient, not tender. His cart waited, hitched to two weary horses. He climbed aboard with the help of a cane, leaving her to scramble after him in silence. As they rode away from the only home she had ever known, she dared to glance back once. Her mother stood with her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, her face pale, her eyes red though she had not wept openly. Her father had already turned his back, leading the cow into the corral as though that was the true bride of the day. Maria's heart shattered in that moment, realizing her worth had been measured not by her soul, her dreams, or her innocence, but by the milk a cow could provide. The road stretched long and dusty, each bump of the cart rattling her bones. The silence between her and Don Evaristo was suffocating. He did not speak of kindness, nor did he try to ease her fear. Instead, he muttered about chores awaiting her, about how his house was big and empty and how she would now fill it with service. His words painted a picture of a life where she was little more than a servant, bound not by pay but by vows she never chose. The sun sank lower, painting the sky in hues of orange and crimson, as if mocking her with beauty she could not touch. Her eyes welled, but she forced the tears back, determined not to let him see her cry. If he saw weakness, she feared he would crush it out of her. When the cart finally creaked to a halt before his ranch, she stared at the house with dread. It was large, yes, but lifeless, the paint peeling, the shutters broken, the fields neglected. It was not a home but a prison, and she was its newest captive. He yanked her down from the cart and barked orders about supper, about firewood, about where she would sleep. She nodded in silence, her hands trembling as she carried her small bundle of belongings inside. The house smelled of dust and old smoke, the air heavy and stale. She felt as though she had stepped into a tomb, one where her laughter, her childhood, her freedom would be buried. That night, as the coyotes howled in the distance, Maria sat on the narrow bed in the corner of the ranch house, clutching the small cross her grandmother had once given her. She whispered prayers into the darkness, begging for a way out, begging for someone to see her pain. She knew the world saw her as nothing more than a girl sold cheap, a bride for a cow. But deep in her chest, beneath the fear and despair, a tiny ember of defiance burned. She did not know how, or when, but she prayed that one day, something would change. Would it be a stranger's kindness? Would it be her own courage? Or perhaps the will of God himself? She could not say. But as she lay trembling in that cold, silent house, she clung to the faint, desperate hope that her story was not over yet, that even for a girl traded for cattle, destiny might hold something more than misery. The first night bled into the first morning, and Maria rose from the hard, narrow bed long before dawn. Sleep had been impossible, her body had lain still, but her mind had wandered endlessly, circling around what had happened and what was to come. She moved quietly, her bare feet brushing against the cold floorboards, afraid to wake Don Evaristo. But he was already awake. She found him outside, hunched over a pail, his crooked back silhouetted against the faintest blush of morning. He grunted when he saw her, a sound neither greeting nor command, only acknowledgement. "Get the fire going," he said, his voice like gravel rolling in a pan. She obeyed without a word, fumbling with the matches, her hands stiff with the chill. It took her 3 tries before the flames caught, and when they did, he scowled as though she had taken too long. The day unfolded with one task after another, fetching water from the well, scrubbing the soot-blackened pot, sweeping dirt that never seemed to end from the floor. He gave no thanks, only barked orders. Yet Maria did the work with a quiet determination. She had grown up in hardship, knew what it was to carry burdens heavier than her body, to survive on little. But here it was different. At home, even in hunger, she had belonged. Here, she was a stranger, her every movement judged, her silence mistaken for consent. The ranch was eerily empty. No laughter, no voices, not even the bustling noise of hired hands. Don Evaristo had once been prosperous, she gathered from the size of the house and the fences that stretched far into the horizon. But now it was clear he lived mostly alone, save for her arrival. His cattle had thinned, his land was dry, and his strength no longer matched the ambitions he once carried. That, perhaps, was why he had wanted her, not for love, not even for companionship, but for labor. By midday, Maria's body ached. She paused for a moment by the doorway, gazing out at the endless sky. For the first time in her life, she was far from her family, from the small village where she had grown up. Though they had betrayed her, traded her away, the ache for her mother's embrace and her siblings' laughter struck her like a physical blow. Tears welled in her eyes, but she brushed them quickly away when she heard his cane strike against the floorboards behind her. "You'll earn your keep here," Don Evaristo said flatly. "Don't think because you're young you'll be spared. I paid for you, girl. You'll work." The word stung more than the hardest labor could. He had not said, "married you," but "paid for you," as if she were no more than a beast he had bought. Maria lowered her head, her lips pressed together so tightly they hurt. She wanted to scream that she was not a cow, not a tool, not a thing to be owned. But her voice lodged in her chest like a stone. As the sun slid lower, Maria noticed how quiet the ranch was, how loneliness hung heavy in every corner. The man barked and complained, but she also saw how his hands trembled when he lifted heavy things, how he coughed when the dust caught his throat, how he sat longer and longer between tasks. His body betrayed his age, though he tried to mask it with cruelty. That evening, she cooked a simple meal of beans and cornbread. He ate greedily, saying nothing, crumbs falling into his beard. She sat across from him, eating in silence, her stomach twisting with hunger but her spirit twisting even more with dread. He caught her staring at the cross around her neck, the only thing she had brought that felt hers. "What are you praying for, girl?" he asked, his tone mocking. Her voice came out soft but steady. "For strength," he laughed, a short, bitter sound. "Strength won't help you, only obedience will." Maria lowered her eyes again, but inside her chest, that ember of defiance glowed brighter. He thought she was too small, too weak, too powerless to resist. But she carried something he had long lost, hope. It frightened her, yet it also made her stronger. Later that night, when the house was dark and Don Evaristo snored in his chair, Maria crept outside. The stars spread across the heavens like scattered silver dust. She tilted her head back and let the wind touch her face. For the first time since leaving her village, she whispered words not of fear but of promise. "I will not be broken," she murmured to the night. "Not by him, not by this life. She knew she was bound here, at least for now. But bound did not mean defeated. There were stories whispered in the village about women who had endured worse and found a way out, women who had turned cruelty into courage. Perhaps she could be one of them. Perhaps fate had not finished with her yet. The days that followed did not grow easier, but they became clearer. Maria worked, yes, but with every task, she studied. She learned which parts of the ranch needed repair, where the fences sagged, where the cattle grazed. She learned how he grew tired more quickly, how he relied more on her hands than his own. And she learned, too, that she was not helpless. The land was cruel, but it taught resilience. The loneliness was heavy, but it sharpened her will. She also discovered something else, a strange pity for the man who had bought her. Though she hated him for what he had done, she saw in his eyes, sometimes in the briefest unguarded moments, a deep emptiness. He was rich in land, and poor in soul, a man who had everything once and now clung to control over her because it was the only power left to him. One night, as he sat coughing in the corner, Maria placed a cup of warm tea in his hand. He looked at her in surprise, suspicion flickering in his cloudy eyes. She said nothing, only returned to her place by the fire. For the first time, he did not bark at her. He drank the tea in silence. It was not love, it was not even trust. But it was a crack in the wall that divided them, a reminder that even in a life built on cruelty, humanity could flicker through. Maria clung to that flicker. It did not erase her suffering, but it planted a seed. And deep inside, she knew seeds had a way of growing, even in the harshest soil. As she lay in her narrow bed again, staring at the shadows on the ceiling, Maria realized something. She could not choose how her life had begun here, but she might choose how it unfolded. The cow had been the price, but she would not let it define her worth. She was more than what had been traded, more than what had been forced upon her. And though she did not yet know how or when, she promised herself that one day, she would rise above it all, not just as a girl bartered for livestock, but as a woman who claimed her own destiny.